I'll give it a couple more minutes for some folks to join. And as you're joining, feel free to add your attendance to the meeting notes and anything on the agenda. There's not much on the agenda right now.
Michael, you're just hogging the agenda.
Yeah. I guess maybe give it another minute. Let me just also ping in the chat and then we can get started.
I just dropped the link in there from the other meeting notes that I had for supply chain integrity working group positioning SIG, I guess, versus.
Oh, is it? Wait, no, this is the regular one, right?
Okay, I know Melba moved us from the positioning meeting a few times. I wasn't sure which one now.
Yeah, so I think it is now every other week. So this week will be the normal sort of full group, and then next week is the positioning group.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Yep. All right, so we can get started. And let me just copy the link into the chat there, just in case. All right. And yeah, we can get started here. As I'm sure folks will join as they need. So just as a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. It'll be uploaded to YouTube shortly after. And your participation in this meeting is an agreement to abide by the OpenSSF Code of Conduct. Before getting into the agenda, is there anybody new to the group who would like to introduce themselves? Okay. Sounds good. Okay. So only one item on the agenda today, at least as far as I can see on the meeting notes. If folks have other things they want to add on, we have a fairly open agenda today. But the one thing just wanted to kind of bring up, so this is from for Guac. This is from the TAC. So the maintainers of the creators and maintainers of Guac. So that's myself from Kusari, as well as a few other folks from Kusari, as well as a few folks from Google, and some other people from Purdue University have come together and sort of we created, Guac, which Guac, for folks who are not familiar with it yet, it's sort of it's a database where we're pulling in supply chain metadata like SBOM, salsa attestations, and all that great stuff, putting it into a giant graph so that folks can better understand their supply chain and understand aspects of their supply chain for stuff like, vulnerability management, for, policy and all that good stuff. So that we had been working on it for, just about a year now. And we have an initial beta out. And we, based on discussion from the maintainers, we decided to contribute or we decided to talk about contributing Guac to the OpenSSF. And largely the TAC was very receptive of accepting Guac. There's a lot more details about some of the things in there, like a potential public service database or for open source and stuff like that, as well as what exact level it falls under the OpenSSF governance. Sorry, the OpenSSF maturity, project maturity. So it's a little unclear if we're incubating or sandbox. That sort of details will get sorted out. But one of the things that we were looking at as well was, I know we had discussed this previously with the group, like if there was interest, would this group be open to sponsoring? I know that there was some initial sort of interest in that. And so I don't think we have enough folks today to just kind of make that official. But this is actually, to take a step back, this is actually one of the, I'm going to be opening up a GitHub issue about the OpenSSF governance. There seems to be some confusion on exactly, also, one second. So there should just be the one meeting notes doc. The positioning one is not the correct one. It should just be the this doc here. If there is a second copy, or if there's something that is, yeah, it should be that one. But anyway, one of the things that's a little confusing is the tag governance. The TAC governance says that you should go to the TAC first, and it needs to be accepted to the TAC before getting sponsorship from other groups. But TAC sponsor, but the actual application process asks which working group would sponsor your project. So it seems like a catch-22. It's like I can't say who's going to sponsor it if it's not accepted yet, and I can't, so there's some confusion there. Largely, it seems like the idea would be, right now at least, it would probably get accepted, and then we come to the TAC just to we come to this group to say, hey, do you want to sponsor? And we kind of have a vote there. Andrew?
Yeah, I had a question. Well, one, I didn't realize that Guac wasn't already part of OpenSSF, but as part of this whole process to get Guac into OpenSSF and looking for sponsorship, what does this process look like for tools, projects, whatnot to become part of OpenSSF? What does it mean? You said that there are different levels, incubating, sandbox. I mean, I'm familiar with some of these concepts from CNCF, but like, I don't know what it means in relation to OpenSSF.
Sure. So I'll put this also. I put it in chat and also put it in the meeting notes. So the governance stuff is inside of the governance is inside the TAC repo. So to take a step back, before I answer that question, I'm going to go into a slightly, hopefully short tangent here. So OpenSSF's charter is very different than CNCF's. So CNCF has a ton of projects. Often these projects are brought, like they're contributed to CNCF, but they're coming from vendors who are, selling enterprise versions of, these pieces of software. So if you look at, a lot of stuff, there's different service meshes and different policy engines, and all those things are often backed by companies or other large organizations like, universities. So it's usually, incubated and then kind of brought in. OpenSSF kind of has been a little bit different, mostly focused traditionally on stuff like standards or, specifications, those sorts of things. So STALSA, S2C2F. And that's not to say that there aren't tools related to those things. So for example, scorecard itself is actually more of a specification, And then it just so happens we also have the implementation of Scorecard, but you can implement Scorecard yourself. So that kind of has, that's starting to change a little bit as we try to do a little bit more, right? So if you look at something like SigStore is a giant project with a lot of different things in it, and it's probably one of the things that's most, it's pretty popular. It is pretty widely out there now, and it's also sort of a project that's very different than a lot of the other projects that have been more on the specification side, threat modeling side, diagrams, and all that good stuff. So with that said, they started to try and say, hey, what can we do to be a bit more for stuff like these tools and projects? What can we do to kind of make that a bit more rigorous, add some governance? So that's where the TAC stuff comes in. There's some ambiguity still in there that's being sorted out, but largely the idea is if you want to go and contribute something, a project, the way that it's the rules as they are written, the law as it is written, states that what you do is you open up a pull request into the TAC with some details, and the issues I have in here, I think it's TAC pull request 178. So this one here, and I can actually go in and share what that looks like in a second here. Once I do this, and share my screen. Is it? Yep. So this, whoops. So the main things are the application looks something like this, and there is a template for it. But the basic idea is list of project maintainers. There's some requirements, like you can't just be a single, it can't just be a single company or a single organization that's contributing. It must have a plurality, or it must at least have two. In our case, this was a collaboration between Kusari, Google, Purdue, and City. The mission of it needs to have a mission of the project. The mission of the project should sync up at least with the TAC, with the OpenSSF charter in the least, and then should also fall under, eventually should fall under a working group, as long as it's not a top level project in the OpenSSF. And exactly what would fall under a top level project versus what should always fall under a working group is a little unclear. If there is project adoption, it should be listed here. So in our case, we actually have a bunch of folks who've been adopting Guac. So this is stuff like, different groups that have talked about adopting Guac. It needs to have governance. And so we have our governance listed in our repo. And then IP policy and licensing due diligence. So this is something that I have. The other issue that's in there, 179, is essentially an open issue with the Linux Foundation to have them do due diligence on us to make sure that, all IP is being released in the right way, and that this, our project Guac is not somehow pulling in other folks' IP without permission and all that good stuff. And then just some project references in here. So once this was open, or there was some confusion on exactly what gets opened first, blah, blah, blah. But the basic idea is we came to the TAC with this issue. We, talked to the TAC in a TAC meeting. They had some debate on what makes sense there. And then, based on the conversation, largely, there seemed to be interest. They're going to go vote on it in probably the coming days or coming weeks. And then assuming that that goes well, then we get adopted into the OpenSSF. And then we, I think, come back to this project for sponsorship. I was coming back to this working group for sponsorship. Did that answer your questions?
Yeah, I think that it answers a lot of it. So if there is some project that, like, say, for example, doesn't meet that minimum criteria for maintainers across organizations, is there still room, like, would it still be possible to bring something like that to, say, this working group and be like, hey, we have this, it's something that we think is really interesting, here's the benefits, and see if there's engagement before being able to bring it to the TAC for the next step?
Yeah, I believe so. That's actually been, that was one of the things we did with Guac as well, is we brought it here first, and we brought it to a couple other working groups just to get general like feedback and feeling around the groups. Like, does this seem to be of interest to people? And then based on largely good feedback, we cleaned some things up and yada yada, and then we brought it to the TAC. And I think that's kind of where so I'm not going to name any names, but I know that the thing that I believe the TAC is really trying to make sure of is that when folks contribute to projects, that it's not a single maintainer sort of project. I know that there are certain projects that have been kind of they came in before some of these governance rules around needing to have multiple maintainers from multiple organizations and affiliations. There's some projects there, but I believe new projects, they're really wanting to make sure that it's not purely like a vendor just sort of throwing something in there and saying, hey, now we have an OpenSSF project. And they also want to make sure that, if they have, they want to make sure that, it's not just a particular company or organization trying to just sort of throw something out there. They can say, hey, we have something under the OpenSSF, and then, but they still essentially maintain the control of the project. It should be something that is open source, falls under some sort of open governance, and it's not something that, like, one particular company, organization, et cetera, can sort of strong arm other folks. And I believe that was, that is, I don't believe anybody has done that, right? Just to be clear, just that I believe that's a worry, and they want to make sure that's one of the reasons why they want to have multiple maintainers. And so, for example, if you have let's say a project that either is open source or you plan to open source, and let's say it doesn't have multiple maintainers from different organizations, then I believe they're looking to at least show that you can bring on new maintainers, and that those new maintainers are not just like token maintainers. They're not just purely like, oh yeah, we added someone from another company just to kind of hit the rule. Because I know that has come up a couple of times, was, a particular organization has done the majority of the work. They then added a new maintainer to try and hit the rules, and people, had called out, hey, it looks like you just added a new maintainer yesterday. It looks like that new maintainer hasn't made any commits to the project. It seems a little suspicious. So I believe that the idea is, long term at least, you can show that, yes, you bring on new maintainers, you are able to kind of show that this is an actual project that is more than one organization, and so on and so forth. And then it can be brought into the OpenSSF.
And so all these rules, guidelines, I mean, you see them as being more guidelines with where the intention or the intent is what the TAC takes into account. And so it really comes down to having that conversation with a TAC and seeing where that tool needs to go. And the reason that I am poking on a little bit is just because I feel like with the Sterling toolchain that there's opportunities for potential interest, I guess, in OpenSSF. If the Sterling toolchain might just be working to understand what the opportunities are, or if the Sterling toolchain is going to do more than just identify the capabilities, but also potentially identify some other projects within its own organization, which can help to make or to fill in some of the gaps that might be present. There might be interest from various tools around once they start hearing about this to be more involved.
Yes. So on that front, for folks who are not super familiar, the Sterling tool, it's formerly known as the Sterling tool chain, but it's being used as a placeholder name until we figure out something better. We're still figuring out the scope and everything else, but largely the problem has been, there is a problem generally in application and supply chain security and all that stuff. The problem, at least as far as a lot of folks are debating about exactly the definition, but the basic problem that has been put out there is it is hard to do the end-to-end SDLC security, or folks are not even aware of what they need to do. What do I mean by that? That, like, an example here is it could be very unclear whether or not a particular issue came in at the dev level, like as in a developer's workstation got compromised, or a developer either purposefully or inadvertently introduced a SQL injection or whatever. Folks are unaware of whether or not a dependency caused an issue. Like where is this vulnerability coming from? Where are these issues we're seeing coming from? And then also when we go to deploy to production, like, are we actually making sure that we're only deploying what we expect to deploy and making sure that it fits all the various rules, right? And so the problem here is at a large company, a giant bank, let's say, right? They look at some of these things and they say, great, we have a bunch of policies in place to make sure that we're doing these things. Whether or not it's efficient is another story, but that's largely the big problem. And they also say, hey, a large bank says, well, we can't use startup tool XYZ because we don't have confidence that startup tool XYZ is doing their SDLC in a way where they're not, are they allowing devs to just write code on their personal laptops with no restrictions? And hey, it turns out the developer, wasn't being malicious, but they had downloaded something on their personal laptop that was malware, and now the source code got injected with bad stuff. And so even though it wasn't the intent, bad stuff's out there, right? Are folks generating SBOMs that they can, and those sorts of things? Are they building it via Salsa and doing the right things from a build security standpoint? So there's a concern here of like, there's a big problem here. And so what can we do to solve it? And at least this initial, the initial things that have been thrown out there are perhaps we need to build an architecture that sort of describes the capabilities that need to be there, from secure development as a capability, secure ingestion as a capability, and those sorts of things. And then once that's done, we need to look at also how those things communicate with each other. Like, so how does secure dev communicate to the secure build that, yes, secure dev was done correctly, so that the secure build knows, like, yes, this was done with commits were signed, software was developed in appropriate places, and so on. And then finally, we need to then start to say, okay, great, what are the tools that actually do those things to hit those capabilities, to get to Andrew's point? And I think that sort of thing is where there's a lot of current conversation about whether or not the OpenSSF will take on that work, whether or not the OpenSSF will, let's say, take in that work. So if there are open source projects out there, let's just say an open source secure artifact repository. If there is an open source secure artifact repository, would the OpenSSF be willing to take that in as a project? It's a little unclear. There's debate about what exactly is the scope of the OpenSSF charter, or is it more along the lines of, tool choice is kind of something that comes in later, and is just something that is like, we can throw out the architecture and say, hey, as long as you hit the architecture, you hit the sort of interfaces, as in like the inputs and outputs, and you have a set of conditions for what you're actually doing, maybe that's enough, and then whatever fits in there fits in there. But I believe a lot of the details on that are still up for debate. Did I describe that correctly to folks who were there?
I wasn't at the call yesterday, but I think that it makes sense from the previous calls. I think it'll be interesting to see how the uncertainty from the charter's scope plays out to like see how much it is just defining those interfaces versus actually having quote unquote ownership of some tools that are implemented upon those interfaces.
Yeah, and the there's current debate about like because there's folks who within the group who work at vendors who have very clearly made it a point to say, hey, we do not want to help the OpenSSF build something that competes with its own members per se. But I believe that there seemed to be a lot of interest from the perspective of at least trying to build a specification or a set of standards or a set of guidelines around what good looks like in a secure supply chain and a secure SDLC, so that, and in my opinion, I think that actually helps out a lot of vendors to say, hey, my scanning tool interacts with another vendor's build tool because they speak the same sort of language, they the same inputs, the same outputs, they follow like a common communication language from an API perspective, which means that earlier these things didn't interoperate correctly, and it led to a lot of issues. But now they all interoperate. Now lots of folks can buy my stuff or whatever. I think there's a lot there that will help out. But there's also debate about, for example, I know the biggest debate is whether or not, from a tool perspective, if it's up to the OpenSSF to build the tools themselves. A lot of folks who have a large background in open source have said the majority of open source that's out there does not start purely in open source. It tends to be an organization, a person, a company, or whatever decides to do something. They then open source it, and then they contribute it to an organization, as opposed to an organization saying, hey, here's a need, and trying to do the product work on that side. So I think that there is some stuff there about exactly, there's some debate there.
Yeah, and you really get into the nuances about whether the OpenSSF doing the development versus the development being done elsewhere and contributing to OpenSSF. Ultimately, it all might end up landing within OpenSSF somehow, but it's where that work originates.
Yeah, and I agree with that, and I think that generally also, if you look at the majority of successful open source projects, the large ones, right, it's because they're backed by companies that are willing to put the time, money, and resources, even if it does fall under the Linux Foundation or another open source group.
Cool. Thanks for the conversation.
Yeah. Do folks have any other questions about either anything that we just discussed? Okay. Does anybody else have any other questions, comments, things that they want to add on the agenda? I know we still have a half hour. We can end it early if folks don't have anything else. But it's the floor is open. Cool. Well, if there's nothing else, everybody can get back about a half hour, and see you all in a couple weeks. Later.